So my name's Nicole Walsh and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Chamber of Commerce here based in the Northern Territory, based in Alice Springs. So thank you everyone for coming. Today's a really exciting event of pursuing gender equity in 2022. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which we meet today, the Arrernte people, past, present and future. So why are we here today? A little bit of story about how this came about. Last year we were visiting CAWLS, we were talking about how as a legal service, as the Chamber of Commerce, do we still get asked, what is the need for women-only events? And we had a really big chat about it, and we still get that question a lot. Why do we need women's-only services? Why are you having business, women in business lunches? So we really had to have a bit of a think about it. And then we started chatting. Julianna over here came up with an organisation that she'd been involved in the past with Champions of Change, and it's really about men being part of the conversation as well. We were just so excited, and we thought this is a really good opportunity for us to do something together and really talk about this and talk about, because we didn't know, are we right doing this? Are we right, or certainly as a chamber, is it a right thing to be having women's only events? Is it not? Sorry, I just knocked something off there as well. So it was a really good conversation to have, and so Julianna said that she had someone that she worked with before, Justice Chris Maxwell, which is here with us tonight. We did try and do this last year, twice. So unfortunately, because of COVID happened, but we're very, very excited, and thank you to the NT government being able to help us with this, being able to give us a grant to actually be able to put on this event tonight. We're excited about to have this conversation, and we're really looking forward to it. So thank you everyone for coming to the Northern Territory Government sponsoring, and for everyone here. Julianna will introduce all the panel speakers shortly, but I would like to introduce Justice Chris Maxwell. Justice Chris Maxwell commenced practice at the Victorian Bar in 1984. He was appointed Queen's Counsel in 1998. He practices in constitutional and administrative law and revenue law. In 1994, Justice Chris Maxwell was counsel assisting the judicial inquiry into the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. In 2003 to 2004, Justice Maxwell undertook a review for the Victorian Chamber of the Occupational Health and Safety Act 1985. In July 2005, Justice Maxwell was appointed President of the Court of Appeal, Supreme Court of Victoria. In 2015, he was made the Champion of the Order of Australia in the Queen's Birthday Honours. Justice Maxwell joined the Champions of Change National Group in 2015. Justice Maxwell retired as the President of the Court of Appeal on July 15, 2022, after serving in the role for 17 years. So I'd like to introduce Justice Chris Maxwell. Very excited to hear from you, really excited to hear more about Champions of Change and how that works and how that's going to be part of the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It's a huge pleasure and a privilege to be here with you this afternoon. It's the first time my wife Sarah and I have visited the lands of the Arrernte people, and in our travels over the last 3 days, it's been deeply moving to begin to understand this land and the people who have occupied it for such an unimaginably long time. And as a visitor from down south, I pay my respects to the community and their elders. I want to congratulate CAWLS and the Chamber of Commerce for putting this tremendously important event together, and to see a crowd like this at 6 o'clock on a Monday evening is really thrilling. As I'll be explaining, I'm a relative newcomer to gender equality issues, not just because I'm a bloke, but because for a long time I believed in gender equality but wasn't doing anything about it. So I bring enthusiasm rather than expertise. Fortunately, you've got a panel with a good deal of expertise. But what I have learnt in the last 7 years, in processes I'm going to describe, is that this kind of gathering is the way forward on gender equality. It begins with listening and learning. And that's what I've done since I was asked to join this curiously named Champions of Change organisation in 2015. You need to listen and learn because you need to be open to new ideas. You need to be open to being challenged about your own assumptions. And for men, you need to be ready to learn about the very different experiences of women at all stages of their lives. So it was 2015 when the Victorian Equal Opportunity Commissioner got in touch asking if I would join this coalition of men in senior positions, which was called Champions of Change. Now, that's an unfortunate label because it suggests that you're the best. In fact, it's using the word champion in a quite different way as an advocate. That is, I champion the cause. I'm going to stand up for change. It was a group of 24, most of them private sector CEOs, from banks and Medicare and superannuation funds, and several like me from the public sector. Two key principles underpin the thinking within the Champions of Change group. The first is that we as men were being asked to step up beside women. This wasn't about the blokes having the answers, it was about blokes lifting their game. That we would assume some responsibility to share the load of driving change, that we would become allies for women who have worked tirelessly for decades for gender equality, that we would do our bit. And the second thing was coming to realise that when male leaders step up, they can make a difference. There is something you can do, and as I've come to realise, you've got a responsibility to do it. This concept of the leadership shadow, which I learnt about in the Champions group, that when you're in a senior position, what you do, what you say, how you behave, has strong impact through your organisation. And it's important to have a different voice. The male voice being heard is a way of saying this is not just a women's issue. This is a society issue. This is a human rights issue. This is about the basics of equality to which we all subscribe. So this group has met quarterly for the last 7 years. We've had a few changes of membership. We meet from 8 till 10 in the morning. And during COVID, we've done it by Zoom. And the CEOs come. They don't send their deputies or their media relations officers. They come themselves. They make time in their diaries to come. And I've been really struck by that. And if they don't come, they get asked to leave. So it's about commitment and it's about accountability. And what you do each quarter is report on what you've been doing in your organisation, what you've been saying, what you've been learning. And around the table, it's again listening and learning. And it's about accountability. That's one of the exciting things about it. Yes, you turn up, and yes, you're asked before each meeting, well, what have you been doing? And the group publishes its own figures on progress in getting women into leadership positions in their organisations. So there's no place to hide. If you're slow getting women into the leadership pathway, it'll show up in the annual figures, and we publish them. They're not just internal, they're published to the world at large. In the last 2 years, we've included a number of female leaders. Some of you may know of Worley, a very big engineering company. Well, their CEO is a woman. She's in our group. And of course, it's one thing for men to commit to doing things better, but as I've learnt, you need to be hearing from women to work out what it is you need to do or stop doing. At the start, each of us we were encouraged to hold listen and learn sessions. So I was asked to work with the legal profession, and I had 8 or 10 meetings with groups like those of you at individual tables. 8 or 10 lawyers, men and women, and I was really shocked by what I heard. You know, I'd travelled through the legal profession as a comfortable white man, and then I started to hear about exclusionary behaviours directed at women, denial of opportunities, casual sexism, and all the way to sexual harassment and sexual assault. Well, you don't need to hear too much of that to realise that there's something that needs to be done, and it spurred me into action. And as I say, I think that's the power of listening. It sparks your curiosity, and it challenges your moral sense of yourself. So I set up some permanent groups. I thought, well, if we can do it in our CEO's group, I can do it with lawyers. And over the last 5 years, I've had groups called Advocates for Change. Men and women, senior and junior, barristers and solicitors, same model. Bring your ideas. I'm not the expert, I'm just bringing you together so that we can work together to discover what we can do. And then you come back 3 months later and say, well, actually, yes, I've taken steps to encourage junior women in my part of the profession. Or, as I was able to say, we've started in the Court of Appeal listing appearances in court by gender. So, for the first time, we know what we might have suspected, which is the blokes get all the speaking roles. Why would that be when more women have graduated in law for the last 40 years than men? Where are the blockages in the system? And the really exciting thing I would say to those of you, and I'm going to end up by saying, give it a go. Set up a group. Ask 3 or 4 friends, colleagues, to sit down with you and have an open discussion about this. I found that everybody I invited came. Kind of, oh wow, I'd love the chance to think a bit harder about this. I've never really engaged with these issues. And I've managed to involve over that 5-year period about 150 lawyers. In February this year, with the end of one process, we published a document to the profession incorporating people's suggestions. Sexual harassment, what can we do about it? And of course there's a multiplier effect, because everyone who's been in the room having the discussion thinks about what they can do. Seems to me there are 3 stages. Awareness raising, that's how it started for me. Engagement, yes, you get more engaged. And then leadership, advocacy, you are energised to do something about it. And once you've begun to immerse yourself in these issues, as I've found, you notice things you wouldn't have otherwise noticed. You hear things differently. In the Champions group, we had to take what's called the panel pledge, which is, I will never appear on an all-male panel. And I haven't in 7 years. And simple, but significant. And twice now I've been invited to be on panels, and I've rung up the organisers and said, no, you've only got blokes. If you don't change the composition of the panel, I'm not coming. Now that was just a little bit of consciousness raising which happened for me. Crucial issue I've learnt, and I've mentioned it a little bit already, is counting, measurement. Assertions about good intentions are a necessary beginning. But as I discovered talking to senior people in the legal profession, they said, oh no, we've got great policies, everything's going fine. And then you start measuring what isn't happening, and you can say, incontrovertibly, no, it's actually not going very well, and we're not progressing anything like as fast as you seem to think we are. So, whatever organisation, large or small, have a look at the gender pay gap. Have a close look at your payroll. Have you got women being paid less for work equivalent to male employees who are getting more? And if so, why would that be? Or as I said earlier, have a look at your leadership structure. How many women on the board? How many women in middle, senior management positions? And track it over time. Because the figures don't lie. and they're a great answer to backlash. What's all this fuss about women? What about the blokes? Have a look at the figures, and then you'll understand why there's a fuss. This is entrenched inequality. That's what it's about. This is about basic fairness. This is about people having reasonable opportunities to fulfil themselves and being appropriately rewarded for what they do. Have you got any problem with any of that? So, as I say, once you have measurement, you have accountability. Because we could say in the Court of Appeal after 4 years, look, we're getting a slight uptick in female barristers with speaking roles, but not much, not as fast as it should be. So I then started to have meetings with solicitors who brief the barristers and clerks who farm out the work, and you start to raise their awareness. So I suppose I want to conclude with a couple of more particular things about the legal side of these issues, but what I'm really trying to do, I think, is respond to Nicole's invitation. Tell us about what this champions thing is. Well, in the end, it's a pretty simple concept, which is that there are a lot of men, and of course women out there, who are keen to have a conversation about this stuff and are open to learning and changing their thinking. It just needs somebody who's prepared to send out a few invitations, get the ball rolling, and you see the momentum develop. And you might find, as I have, this came halfway through my judicial career, this was an absolute watershed for me. Dramatically changed my last 7 years at the Court of Appeal because the gender lens became a lens through which I was looking at things, not just a lawyer's lens. Two quick things to conclude. One of the things I learnt, including through judicial education, was that the judicial voice on these issues is important, and in particular, of course, I'm referring to domestic and family violence as it emerges in the courtroom, meaning when someone's being prosecuted, and it made me think about the language we use. It's something on which we need the help of experts. I presided over a murder trial where the accused was a victim of family violence. And the expert witness was enthralling, as I and the jury came to understand through her evidence what the effect on the accused had been of sustained psychological and physical violence. And equally in sentencing, and I had the privilege of a brief meeting with one of your judges a moment ago, and hearing something about the kind of work on the criminal side that is being done with perpetrators. Now that's really hard stuff, and my own exposure to it, very limited in the Court of Appeal. But your judges, I would suggest, are people who should be in the conversations that I've been suggesting you have, because they see a particular dimension, perhaps one of the hardest dimensions, the end of the process. But again, learning what to say to a perpetrator seems to me a really tricky set of issues on which we need to learn from people who know best. And lastly, and this is a quite different perspective, I've learnt in the last 2 or 3 years about the value of legal services being delivered through a multidisciplinary lens. Lawyers are trained to think, well, I've got all the answers and I'll just give you legal services. But what I've come to understand is that in an area like domestic and family violence or mental illness, you've typically got a multitude of problems circling around in the same family or person, and if you can deal with them in the one place through the one doorway, whether it's financial or psychiatric or emotional, family law or criminal law, the benefits of integration are really powerful. And as I said, I look forward to hearing from people who work hard and expertly in this field. Thank you.
So Shay, I might invite you to kick us off. You were born and raised in Mbantua, and as I've said, you're the Research and Partnership Manager at the Equality Institute and a postdoctoral fellow with the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at the Australian National University. So perhaps if you could start by just telling us about your work, and in particular what gender inequality looks like in Central Australia from your perspective. And of course, we'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on the intersection between gender bias and racial bias.
Cool, sure. Small question. My name's Chay Brown. I'm a researcher. My background is researching what works to prevent violence against women in the Northern Territory. I'm born and raised here, and since that time I've gone on to lead a number of research projects, fairly recently looking at experiences of technology-facilitated abuse among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in regional and remote areas. I've also globally led the development of global shared research agenda for research on violence against women and girls in low and middle income countries, and also a part of the authoring process for Australia's National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children 2022 to 2032. So just a few bits and pieces. Gender inequality and what it looks like in Central Australia. I think I'll start with the national context and what it looks like nationally. So we know that nationally, women earn $261.50 on average per week less than men do. We know that when women retire, they retire with half the superannuation, on average half the superannuation savings as men. We know that women aged 55 years and above are the fastest growing demographic of homeless people in Australia. And we know that women do more than double the amount of unpaid care work than men do, and that's exacerbated when you add children into the mix. And the more children, the greater that disparity becomes. And then things like pandemics, like the COVID pandemic, they throw all of that into sharp context. So the COVID pandemic, it's estimated, put Australia back 26 years in achieving gender equality. And as it stands, Australia is not doing that well on gender equality front. So we are ranked 43rd in the world for gender equality, despite being the 9th richest nation in the world. So we do have the funds and the means to address gender equality, but do we care enough to actually do it? The evidence suggests we don't. When we talk about Central Australia, all of those things that I've talked about, the national landscape when it comes to the pay gap, the superannuation gap, unpaid care, homelessness, all of that is exacerbated by geographic disadvantage. So, for example, in Central Australia, what that looks like is, who here has tried to get a child into childcare? Here, anyone? So at the moment, they're estimating up to a 5-year wait for a childcare placement. So your kid is going to be in primary school by the time that becomes available. Now, how does that link to gender equality? We know that women are more likely to be in low paid and insecure employment. So that means when it comes down to it, in dual family income, in a dual household, heterosexual relationships, usually it is the mother who has to give up their work to stay at home and care for the child, and that care work is undervalued and underappreciated. There's nothing wrong with these roles per se, gender roles. It's when we begin to ascribe more value to one over the other. And in Australia, we have decided that women's care work is not as valuable as men's economic work, and that's a problem. Because men do not go out to work to support women being at home. Women support men's careers by being at home, caring for children and caring for households. We know that in Central Australia, the housing wait is up to 10 years. And that's including priority listings. So when we're talking about women experiencing violence, when we're talking about women trying to meaningfully participate in the economy, all of that exacerbates their experiences and mean they cannot access the same economic opportunities as men do. We know that food insecurity as it exists in Central Australia disproportionately affects women. And it disproportionately affects them because women are far more likely to be caring for children and be caring for large households. So food insecurity comes to impact them more. We also know that women in regional and remote areas experience far higher rates of violence than they do in urban areas. And we know that in Central Australia, in the Northern Territory, we have the highest rates of domestic, family and sexual violence in Australia, including the highest rates of domestic violence-related homicides, and by a long way. And when women do experience those violence in these regions, in geographically disadvantaged regions, it means that they don't have the same access to services when they do experience violence. So that again exacerbates the impacts on them. And I haven't even begun to talk about disability and ethnicity. We know that all of those things mean that women of colour, First Nations women, women with disabilities, our LGBTQI plus siblings all experience far higher rates of disadvantage, including higher rates of violence. So that's some of the picture.
Thank you, Shay. That's incredibly comprehensive, but I think what you have done is also highlight why it's so complex, and tonight will be simply an introduction to some of the issues that we really need to have some further reflective conversations about as a broader community. And I think what you've also done is highlight why the end result of inequality being domestic and family violence is relevant to all sorts of organisations working in the community, whether they're in housing, whether they're in food security or in the food operations chain, or any of the other services that you mentioned there. So thank you, and we'll get back to inviting you to make some more comments on your observations in Bantua. But I just want to turn to Apajok for the moment. Apajok, you are on the board of CAWLS, and you convene the South Sudanese Women's Group here in Bantua. But you also have quite an extensive and fascinating history of working and volunteering in different roles, advocating for multiculturalism and gender equality. In 2017, you were the Refugee Youth Advocate for Australia and New Zealand in Geneva at the UN High Commission for Refugees. Very impressive. And you're part of the gender audit team from 2017 to 2021. So could you share some reflections on that experience and how that shapes your assessment of gender inequality in Central Australia?
Thanks, Julianna. Hello, can you guys hear me? Yeah. In my experience advocating for the rights of refugee women globally, it's been a tough one, just a tad. So where we started was conducting audits, right? So we can say these policies, these programs are not addressing the needs of refugee women, that refugees are not a homogeneous group, we're not one group, there's no one size fits all. So we started doing audits, we started conducting reports, we started giving them numbers and stats. And that's when the states were like, oh really? Yes, you did have like 3 manals in a row yesterday. And they're like, oh, okay, let's try and have 50% women. We're like, okay, let's do that. And then we started talking about, okay, hey, when you make your statement about refugees, about access to education, what does it look like when refugee women and girls are not included in that? You can't just say, oh, and refugee women and girls. That's tokenistic, that's not genuine. You're not analysing what the barriers are for access to education, right? So if there's a young girl and a young boy who want to go to school in a refugee camp, but the distance is pretty far and the cost is costly, right? So culturally, there's a cultural implication there. So if the family can only afford for one child to go to school, it's going to be the son. And that's because the son is going to be the heir to the family. The girl will be taught how to cook, to clean, and how to be a wife. And that's how she's going to be raised, to be a wife and to go on. And access to education hasn't always included that. So bringing it back to Central Australia, I think it's talking about intersectionality without using that big word. It's talking about women are not just one group, yeah? So when we want to address issues that are facing women, let's look at who is being affected by these issues. If it's domestic violence for Indigenous women, let's look at that. Let's look at why is it happening let's look at family approach, right? Like what's going on with the family, what's going on culturally. Let's try to dissect that and really address it intentionally. And it's about having those specific services to address those communities in a genuine manner and not just tokenistic. Thanks, Julianna.
Can you share with us your thoughts on any specific services for migrant women in Central Australia? Because there has been traditionally a lack of those specific services.
Yes, most definitely. So there was a migration hub where CAWLS provided services to refugee women and migrant women for legal advice. And this was needed because a lot of services we might not feel so welcomed to just walk through the door or confident, right, to walk in and to ask for help. But if this service is targeted towards a particular group, then we'll feel more encouraged and more seen to be able to access that service. And unfortunately, that service will not continue because of funding, but it's needed. We need particular services for specific groups of women if we really want to support them, and if we really we need to put resources there, because resources go to where what we think is important, and if we're not putting resources to supporting and empowering women, then clearly we don't see it as important.
Thanks, Apajok. Jodeen, so you have a long history of working in the NT. You're very familiar to many of our guests here tonight, and I had the privilege of appearing on radio with you earlier today and learning a little bit more about your political career. But you are currently South Australia's Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, and you commenced that role in April 2021. So could you share a little bit about that role and why is it still necessary in relation to gender? And of course, we would welcome your comments on the nature and extent of gender inequality that you encountered whilst living and working in Central Australia.
Well, thank you, and it's nice to be home. Is that, yep? Yeah, very close. Well, the Equal Opportunity Commission, in the Territory you have an Anti-Discrimination Commission ably led by Sally Sievers, and I'm feeling a little bit embarrassed that I'm here, sitting here as opposed to Sally, but I'm prepared to suggest that I know Alice Springs better than Sally. But my office and her office are similar. So we're both governed by legislation, in my case the Equal Opportunity Act, which outlines 13 areas of discrimination. You know probably most of what they are. We are effectively a public-facing complaints body, and we do our best to deal with the complaints as they come in. We get about 700 inquiries a year. I think the Territory office has fewer. And it consolidates into about 250 formal complaints that we try to conciliate. And if we can't conciliate them, we refer them to a tribunal. Roles like offices like mine, unfortunately, are still essential. Firstly, governments always need them because when things go pear-shaped, they always call on the Equal Opportunity Commissioner to undertake a review. And in fact, my office has done 2 in the last couple of years. One into the parliamentary workplace, shameful. One into the legal profession, similarly shameful. But I'm happy to say the legal profession has demonstrated a commitment to turn the ship around. The Parliament is, God knows what they're doing, but they're not doing it very quickly. Discrimination occurs. Many people encounter discrimination, but offices like mine are essential because women are not equal. And Shay touched on it, and I've got a slightly different figure from you, and you would have quoted, Shay, the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, right? Yeah. Well, I've got a slightly different figure, but in 2006, Australia was 15th on this World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index. It's a terrible name. But there are it rates about 156 countries across 4 key indicators: economic security, education, health, political empowerment. So in 2006 we were 15th. Last year we fell to 50th in the world, countries just like us, from 44th position or 43rd from the year before. So what this tells us is that women are not equal. So offices like mine are very important because women need somewhere to complain to. But it also tells us that services like CAWLS, Specialist Women's Legal Services, are essential. And we'll come to that later, I understand. But the gender pay gap is 20%. I think the last figure I looked at was suggesting that women need to work an extra 56 days a year or thereabouts in order to earn the same as men in equivalent jobs. We know that 1 in 5 Australian women experience sexual violence after about the age of 15. We know that participation in the labour force is not equal. So there are a whole lot of indicators that it's incontrovertible that women are not equal. Now we get some sugar hits from the Teal Independents, and I thought that was a great outcome. They're all good women, and I hope they make a change. In the Territory, you are the Parliament finally has got a great representation of women. But on a global measurement, Australia is still faring badly. So offices like mine are still very important. As for my own experiences, sure, I did experience some discrimination, but it's nothing compared to this discrimination that I see women in this community experiencing still every day, and we'll talk about violence as well. But you know, violence is a driver of all sorts of things, but it's fundamentally, in my view, a driver of discrimination in a town like ours.
Thank you, Jodeen. Chansey, you are our Attorney General and Minister for Justice amongst your other portfolios, but you also have previously held the portfolio of remote housing. And I know that Chay touched on the additional vulnerability of women in remote and rural settings. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on how remoteness and gender intersect.
Can everyone hear me? Or do I not need it? Am I loud enough?
You're loud.
Okay, great. Look, I think it's a really good question. Look, I've been in the portfolio of Attorney General and Justice for 8 weeks now, so still getting my head around that in its entirety. I think, as Chay has articulated, it really is crucial, and I think we can't afford to look at this without an intersexual lens when we're talking about this in regional, remote and rural areas, because if we're not looking at it through that lens, we actually will further perpetuate the experiences of people in those areas in our communities. It's crucial that we do so. I think that too often when we are looking at this, and this isn't a criticism of our larger towns, but quite often an already marginalised and minority population of women is even further lost in a regional and remote setting, and we tend to not see them, and we tend to not hear them, and we don't offer them and award them the rightful place in a remote setting or in a regional setting. A lot of our leadership structures and positions are designed to not allow them that place. And that's the role, I guess, of government, that's the role of organisations, that's the role of local government, that's the role of each and every one of us in this room, is to dismantle that system, is to say for every person who says that's always been this way in a remote setting, it's never been a woman, well, why not? Why not now award them the opportunity? I think the other issue which is bubbling away, me sitting up here looking at all you amazing people, but I just want to take the opportunity to say we will not truly close the gap on inequality when we have the attitude that men have. Look at the number of men in this room tonight. How do we expect to change the narrative and respectfully engage and put women where they rightfully should be when so many men in our community say that events like this tonight are just women's business? Not my place. How do we begin to change those attitudes? How do we begin to change that language, that whether we're in a remote community or at our local footy game on the weekend, when the commentator tells everyone on the speaker that such and such is playing like a girl? We are not going to move ahead if we don't dismantle those systems around gender inequality, if we don't dismantle those systems around racism, which is rife in this town. The true journey to achieving these is having respectful dialogue, but each and every one of us has a responsibility when we leave here tonight to talk to people, to talk to our brothers, our uncles, our grandfathers, making sure that our women in a remote setting, in a regional setting, in our towns and cities, actually are awarded what is rightfully and truly theirs is absolutely important. I see it every day in my portfolio areas when, you know, I've come into a portfolio where women's access to prison programs isn't equal to that of a man. That's a problem. That's a really big problem. And we've got to structure it differently. You know, we've designed courtrooms over years and decades that have people who have experienced family and domestic violence in the same waiting room as the person who has caused the harm. These are really important structural issues that we need to dismantle. We're very fortunate in Alice Springs to have the specialist DV court. Now that's not everywhere across the country, it's not everywhere across the territory, but these are programs that we actually need to be rolling out and talking about in a positive light, because if that simple process in allowing our women to feel much safer to engage in the justice system is working, then it needs to be rolled out for every woman across the country to have access to that service. So again, I've probably gone on a bit of a tangent, but we need to, everything that we do when we're looking at this needs to be done fully being aware and cognizant of those intersectionalities, because if we continue to not do that, we are only going to perpetuate the issues and they're going to get worse. We actually need to make sure that we do this, and we have to come together as a community, and it means not just, you know, saying enough is enough or no more. We've actually got to start putting our energy and our real meaning behind driving that change.
Thank you, Chansey. That is a perfect segue to our next section, so I thank you for pointing that out. But Chris, you mentioned the concept of responding to backlash, and I know that that was one of the key collaborative reports that the Champions of Change group published. So I was just wondering if you wanted to expand on that point or share any reflections on the backlash that you encountered in the work that you did with the legal profession in Victoria.
Thanks, Jules. My own experience has involved little backlash. I'm aware of it, and particularly in particular branches of the profession there were some activists pushing for equality and there was a certain amount of backlash. My experience, as I was trying to convey before, has consistently been one of positive engagement. Thanks for inviting me, I'm coming along. I'm keen to do more. And again, I suppose, given what the Minister said, I wouldn't be focusing too much on backlash, at least not in this conversation. There is a terrific report done, really combined effort of the various Champions of Change coalitions, which I had a look at this morning, just to remind myself. And I think that's a set of tools for those of us who are wanting to be movers, however small or large, that there will be those who are put out, offended, annoyed, disagree, puzzled, or worse, hostile. But I must say, I think the thing to focus our energies on, at least for one strand of this, is how do you get the men in the room? Because I do think that male attitudes and awareness are absolutely crucial part of this. But just my one thought on backlash is that it's unavoidable, and it partly shows that you're making some progress because you've at least brought change into focus. And men feel threatened by change if their position of comfortable superiority, entitlement, better pay is threatened. But I found with a judicial colleague who reacted badly when our female Chief Justice announced how committed we were as a court to addressing sexual harassment within the courts. And you've read, as I have, about outrageous behaviour by senior male judges towards female staff. And she said, we want to commit to making these safe workplaces. And this male colleague said to me, you know, I feel as if I'm being accused of being a perpetrator. And I said, well, I don't feel that at all, actually. I feel proud to belong to an institution which is committed to making the workplace safe. It wouldn't occur to me that I was being referred to as part of the problem. And then we talked a bit further and he said, no, well, look, you're right there. I know it goes on. And he would be as keen as I am for a safe workplace. So I think the art of having the conversation with the sceptic or the opponent is quite an art, and I don't have the answers, but it's partly how you respond. I'll finish by just responding to your challenge. I think there are more good men out there than we know. That's been my experience. And this is gradual. It's about one male listening to another and saying, oh, well, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I can see that. Well, come back in a couple of months and let's have another conversation about it. And I suppose, I think there is a challenge to the men to find one or two male colleagues, whether it's in your area of the business community or your professional circle or your football club. You know, I've been worrying a bit about this. How about we have a coffee and talk about our own feelings about gender equality and what we might do? I think you might be surprised, just as my journey has been one of surprise and delight.
Thanks, Chris. That was a really interesting story about how you responded to your colleague, and I think what that demonstrates is the importance of coming to those conversations with curiosity. So curiosity, well, why do you feel that way? Rather than dismissing or invalidating the, call it what you want, pushback, backlash, and really getting to the underlying fear, concerns that might be held, and being able to then address those. I think that played out in your dialogue with your colleague as you described it. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on the topic of backlash, pushback, or resistance? I do have a few specific questions, but this might be a good segue just to open it up.
Oh, look, I think Chris raises a really good point. I absolutely think there is a place for men in this conversation that is one of a positive nature. I mean, I'm an Aboriginal man. I know the effects of demonisation, like the Northern Territory emergency response had on Aboriginal men, where it eroded their place in a community. And I know the trauma that's connected with that. There is absolutely a place in this conversation, but it is us as men who are in this room tonight and who go out of this room to encourage more people to come together to grow the movement. I think that's what we need to do. I also think resistance is often met by sometimes, a lack of understanding or education around what it is that we're actually trying to do and to achieve. And we really need to look at how we communicate that and talk about it, because quite often people are scared of change. People get resistance from when we talk about needing to change things, because for me, in my own life, in my own home, life is great. But we need to do that journey around understanding we shouldn't do things just for us. We should be doing things for the collective, which is our community, which are our family members, which are our people we work with and share those experiences. So how do we look beyond oneself as an individual and more to the collective approach where, just because you're not being discriminated against or you're not being racially profiled doesn't mean that you shouldn't act. How do we come together and how do we run education and awareness that by doing this is something positive? It's, the conversation that we're having now around other areas in our community, raising the age of criminal responsibility. It's the right thing to do, because a child shouldn't be incarcerated. Women should not be discriminated in any aspect of their life because of the sex that they were born. That's what we need to be doing. I know that there are great organisations in the Territory who are dismantling those gender norms, but I guess it goes back to the first question as well. When there's a remote project on in a community, and you know, I've seen a young girl wanting to advance her career and she wants to be an electrician or a builder, and then people will say, oh, but that's not a job of a lady. And it's not, but who are you to tell her that? Who are you to tell the young guy in the school that he can't be a hairdresser or be running the run walk at the, you know, fashion week? This is again really important about gender norms, and it is the role of the education system to be educating people that we do not live in an age that should discriminate on someone based on their sex.
And there's, I'm sure many people in the room familiar, some fantastic work that has come out through TNG Council,
Yes.
the campaign, Boys and Girls
Girls
Plan, and
Can,
Shade, we might get you to comment on that a little bit later. But I wanted to invite Jodeen into the conversation, particularly around this idea of pushback in terms of women's services. Well, we have equality. Why would we need a women's specific service? All women can just go to the same organisation that men can go to. So you were obviously crucial in founding CAWLS, which is a women's only legal service or open to anyone identifying as women, trans people and people who are adversely affected by the patriarchal structures. Did you experience any pushback at the time, and has the pushback changed over the 25 years or so that CAWLS has been in operation? And Apajok, as a current board member, you might want to comment on that as well. Thank you.
There's a bit in that question. I look at my friend and colleague Jane Lloyd, who was also one of the ones who helped set up CAWLS. I don't think trans was much of a thing for us back then, was it? I'm happy to talk about how CAWLS was, or why CAWLS was established, but given I think that much of your question is about resistance, pushback, and so on, we didn't get much. Some of the blokes got their noses out of joint, but they managed to sort of get to the point that, yeah, okay, it wasn't highly objectionable, so they let us do it. And I think ever since then it's demonstrated its need. But I wanted to talk about some of the impediments to gender equality. And I do want to touch, and I'm sorry, Chansey, but I will touch on something you raised. I can't help myself. And I'll get to it in a minute, about the intervention. But as far as I'm concerned, one of the biggest impediments against women's equality in Alice Springs is violence against women.
And colonisation.
Okay, that's your narrative. My point is violence against women. There are some other drivers of violence against women as well. Other drivers of inequality. But violence in this town, we see it on the streets and the town camps routinely. In business, and I know that there are some business owners here, there's things you can do in your workplaces. I think the issues that you need to be aware of: gender pay gap, unequal or inequality with respect to career progression, lack of flexible work hours and so on. But if we're looking at this community as a whole, violence is a key reason why there is inequality here. However, poverty and alcohol are also key drivers of violence against women, therefore inequality of women in this town. And I have to say, Chansey, that lifting the bans on alcohol restrictions in this community and indeed elsewhere is one of the most poorly judged, ill-informed and dangerous policy decisions I've seen in the Territory ever since I've started to pay attention. And your point about what the intervention did to men, well, you're entitled to that view, but me and others, women and men you know and respect, have said that the intervention was a positive discrimination and that it was aimed to assist and protect women and children. And by lifting that ban, You are walking away from all responsibility about violence against women in this community. And I will bet you London to a brick that the next time you're in Parliament, you'll all have a motion about violence against women, and you'll all, with hands on heart, lament the extent of violence against women. You're not helping.
Sorry. No, I've got to jump in here.
Jump in.
I'm sorry.
Shay, I might ask you to jump in, but specifically on changing the story. If we could talk about, address the...
Yeah,
the
I've just got to disagree. I'm sorry, with the utmost respect. I need to disagree with so much that you have said. First of all, alcohol does not cause violence against women. I am so sick of that narrative. I believe your words were it's a driver, and it is not a driver. It can be a reinforcing factor. It can make violence more frequent and more severe, but it does not cause violence. And we know that because violence occurs whether people are drunk or sober. By that logic, all these countries around the world that have prohibition in place would have no violence whatsoever, and that's simply not the case. I'll also support what Chansey said about the intervention, stereotyping Aboriginal men in particular as being pedophiles and violent abusers. That's been reported to me repeatedly throughout my research. What we saw during the intervention, for example, is we saw a big fall in reported sexual violence. Now, how does that happen? Because what we know from national and international evidence is that intimate partner violence or domestic violence co-occurs with sexual violence. So theoretically, when we're seeing very high levels of domestic violence, we should also see a really high level of sexual violence. High reports does not necessarily mean a bad thing. It means that women may have access to reporting. They may be safe enough to finally report. So why did we see this huge decrease in reports of sexual violence? What was reported to us is that women did not want to report. They did not want to come forward because they did not want to perpetuate harmful narratives about Aboriginal men being violent abusers. That is very much linked intrinsically to the Northern Territory emergency response. So I simply cannot sit here and listen to that. I know we're having a great conversation and it's important to do that. However, alcohol does not cause violence against women, and colonisation is very much, and the ongoing impacts of colonisation is the key driver of violence against First Nations women. As it intersects with gender equality, yes, but the ongoing impacts of colonisation on First Nations people, communities, is the key driver, as well as the ongoing impacts on non-Indigenous people, because colonisation has created power structures that continue to benefit non-Indigenous people over First Nations people. And so we are seeing not only violence against First Nation women because they are women, we are seeing violence against First Nation women because they are First Nations.
I am going to jump in, we're going to go right off track. And there is so much to the issues that have been brought up.
But can I just have one more thing, just as a reply? I've famously said sober men beat women. Alcohol doesn't cause, but it's a contributor. So that's the clarification.
Yeah, and there is plenty of research and reading that people can do if they want to really unpack the difference between a driver and a reinforcing factor, and as well. And Shay, just if you can prompt people where they might read about the intersection between colonisation, gender equity, changing the story.
Changing the picture would be the key framework to look at there, but there's also been a lot of amazing research led by First Nations women that unpacks that in great detail.
And I think what we can take from the discussion is this might be the topic for a next panel session. We're going to invite the comment between relationship and gender equality, which we have sort of done naturally throughout the panel. So, Shay, I might just in a nutshell, if you could just respond to this prompt, because it is a form of backlash or resistance that we often encounter, which is working in a space where we might assume that people understand the relationship between gender inequality and domestic and family violence, but often we're confronted by a denial of inequalities present at all, with comments such as, well, she gives as good as she gets. Could you just, in a nutshell, talk to that point and maybe suggest why it's so common, particularly for women accessing a service like ours?
I think that I mean, Chansey raised this point earlier. It's not well understood outside of the sector that gender inequality drives violence against women. So gender inequality and violence against women are mutually reinforcing. So gender inequality creates violence against women, and violence against women creates gender inequality. I think we see that backlash, and backlash is a key concern in that global shared research agenda that I mentioned at the start, which was ranked research questions. The #1 ranked research question and priority was around backlash. And that's because we're seeing like increased backlash or, for example, incel-led mass killings, particularly in the US. We're seeing that those spike. We're also seeing in a number of other instances when women are pushing back against gender norms or social norms that we're seeing elevated levels of violence against them. So for example, we were a part of a study recently looking at female rugby players' experiences of violence in Tonga and Samoa and Fiji. And what we found is that 96% of female rugby players had experienced violence that was directly linked to their playing rugby, and it was corrective violence. So it's violence saying like, you are stepping outside of your gender norm, so we are going to use violence against you to correct your behaviour. So backlash is, it is of key concern. So when it comes to looking at how gender inequality creates violence, it's because it creates the social conditions where violence against women can occur, and then when it is justified and condoned and minimised when it does occur. So that she gives as good as she gets. That's an example of a community attitude that allows violence against women to occur. So gender inequality positions women particularly in economic dependence on men, which makes them more vulnerable to experiencing violence and it more difficult to access help when they do experience violence. That is very simplistic. All power imbalances are a risk factor for violence, and I haven't gotten to touch on intersectionality at all, which is multiple forms of oppression and disadvantage intersecting with gender inequality to create these higher levels of violence. And I just have to end by saying it is not the people who are the problem. It's not First Nations people, for example, who are the problem. It is the systems of power and oppression that creates and puts women in that, make them at increasing likelihood of experiencing violence.
Thank you, Judy. So with that, we're going to move to the last segment of our panel discussion before we open up for some questions. And this is really going to focus on a discussion around some practical steps that we can all take to start to pursue gender equity in a more purposeful way. But I might start with individuals. If each of the panelists could potentially suggest some key things that everybody should be keeping in mind to progress gender equality. And I will vary which end of the panel we start because we'll invite everyone to mention just one or two, just also conscious of the time. Chansey, would you like to begin with some suggestions around what individuals should be doing?
Yeah, look, I think as individuals, it's constantly our role, I think, to... loud enough? I think it's really, we've still got that role to acknowledge that it exists, to call it out, to have those conversations with people about it, but also to ask the questions. When we walk into a room and you're part of a meeting and you see that there is gender inequality.
And what can that look like in a meeting setting?
You know, it can look like, I get that sometimes not everyone is as comfortable as calling things out, but it's about the action that you do before or after the meeting as well. Talk to your, if it's in a workplace, talk to your colleague, talk to your manager around, we really need to make a conscious effort to do this. If it's on an organising committee, then, you know, talk to them about including people in that. I mean, these are things that we all can do in most of the aspects of our life to ensure that we are working towards that. But also, as individuals, getting behind, backing and celebrating the achievements of women in our community is so important, because quite often, we often see when some of our women achieve amazing things, like many of my sisters in the town camps, they are instantly brought down by other people because of where they live, the colour of their skin, or because someone else is jealous. And these are things that we have to be really open to talk about, but celebrate some of the amazing achievements that people in our community are doing, are having, and get behind and support people so that they have that knowing that someone is there helping them, nurturing them, supporting them to achieve great things. I think that they're, as an individual thing, some of the things that we all can do together, and by getting behind and, you know, making sure that we come to events like this, we come to events that call out the structural problems and that we're part of that solution.
And I think the call for celebration might be an answer to some of the pushback we get around, you know, an International Women's Day breakfast or an International Women's Day event. So actually celebrating the fantastic women that we do have in organisations.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, we need to look at our younger generation. They can't be what they can't see. And we need to make sure that we are supporting women to take on those leadership roles so that those young children in school can see the future that they can have. And if we're not working towards that, we're not providing a solid framework and foundation for young people to achieve those roles. So I probably jumped across a little bit, but that's the role of organisations, committees, boards and government as well. We've got to stop talking about being the change, we've got to drive the change.
Okay, so that applies across all levels there, individuals, leaders, government and organisations. And other panellists can also deal with it in a nutshell if they like, or you can separate it out. But Apajok, what would be your key suggestion for individuals?
I think the change has to start with an aspect of self-reflection. Yeah. So let's look at what privilege are we walking around with. Is there white privilege? And if there is, let's not feel ashamed about it. Let's discuss where that comes from. So let's start decolonialising the space, and let's start looking at how can we use this privilege to support or to help women and people of colour and the Indigenous First Nations people. Like, let's try and use it in a way that is helpful and progressing the community, yeah? So I think it's an aspect of self-reflection, and I know it's going to be confronting, but we need to start there. And I think, yeah, and I agree with Chansey about if we're in a meeting and it just happens to be a lot of men speaking, and there are women in the room, let's stop and encourage some of the other women in the room to speak as well, because their perspective is valuable and it is valued. So let's try and be intentional in the way we speak and the way we engage with one another.
Thanks, Apajok. I think the Champions of Change concept in and of itself is centred in privileges and identifying that as a senior and to begin with largely male group, but now obviously involving senior females, there is a level of privilege that can be harnessed and used to create open conversations and share those learnings. So I would say potentially also organisations can encourage that as well. Jodeen, individuals?
I'd do what Chris has done. There he is, sitting around in his chambers, and someone knocks on his door and says, "Well, have I got a deal for you?" And he opens his mind. And he gets on this journey and he learns a great deal, and he very generously shares it with us, and this is a guy with others who's making a difference. Follow him. So all of us need to always open our minds and think about how we can contribute to our communities, our society being one where we're all equal. We're all different, but we should be all equal. So that's the individual, and while I'm here I might also just do what Chansey did and cover off on businesses and government. Businesses promote women, empower women and encourage women. Conduct a gender pay gap or a pay audit. See if the women in your organisation are paid differently, and if they are, fix it. Yeah, there's lots there. Look at your working conditions. Look at security of work and access to leave entitlements. And ensure career progression, and make sure the women in your organisation know that they have the same chance as the man, and both parties will be judged on merit. Flexible working conditions, as I've said earlier, is important, and paid parental leave is also important. So that's for businesses. For governments, I'll go back to violence against women. Stop doing business with communities which are led by perpetrators of violence, and invariably in many communities everyone knows who they are. Don't have them on committees, don't meet with them. In other words, stand up, be strong, and remove the bit of power that some of them have in relation to the women who are also living in their community. So I've covered all three.
Yeah, thanks, Jodeen. Shay, I'll invite you to also potentially cover all three if you'd like to. Power round.
Okay. I think all this work does start with individuals, and we know that all individuals can experience power and oppression in different settings. So I think examining your privilege and examining the unconscious biases that you might hold on to, and we do have to take an intersectional approach to all of this. We cannot have gender justice, for example, without having racial justice. So I thought that was a great comment earlier. Don't be on an all-male panel. Don't be on an all-white panel. This is all a part of the story. And in our individual relationships as well, examining who's doing all the care work, for example. Do we have equal care work in our relationship? Probably not. So how can you work to address that? So for example, when the child is sick, who is taking the day off to care for that child? Beginning to examine those things. I think also speaking out and speaking loudly. And I don't think that has to be done in a way that shames people. I think we can talk about these issues and we can challenge them without bringing people down. I think if we shame people, we shame them into inaction. I think we need to bring people along with us. I think in terms of governments and organisations, we need to talk about parental leave. It needs to become an expectation that men have shared and take shared parental leave. This is where a lot of those inequalities around pay and career progression come from. I think that as a nation, we need to have a policy and a plan to achieve gender equality, which we don't have at the moment. It's on the cards, but we're not there yet. I think that organisations should begin to have gender equality audits, and I think that they should be mandatory. I know we've seen that coming in certain jurisdictions in Australia. I think that needs to be across the board.
And Shay, just what would an audit look like, really quickly? What is the gender equality audit?
Quite simply, it's going through the whole organisation, looking at their policies, looking at their procedures, their hiring practices, and placing a gender lens over the top of it, because we have this fallacy of the meritocracy. This idea that whoever is good enough for the role is going to get the job. But actually research shows that even people with commensurate skills, people are more likely to hire someone who looks like them. And because the person doing the hiring is more often than not a white man, we see that more white men are hired into those spaces. So male-dominated spaces become more male-dominated. And I think that the key to that as well is about beginning to see diversity as a strength, because we know that diverse boards, for example, organisations with diverse boards have higher profit margins, and that they have higher long-term value, and that's true also with boards that have greater women representation as well. So diversity in itself is a skill set and brings incredible value and vibrancy and insight to any organisation. So see it as a strength and hire accordingly.
And there certainly is a research there that links the diversity with even stronger profit margins for commercial businesses. But what you mentioned about the people hiring people that appear to be the same, is affinity bias and is recognised in the Merit Trap, which is a report by the Champions of Change. So again, it's another really good resource to access, and it will help you deconstruct that trap. So it looks at merit being past performance, but also measuring future potential. Future potential is always going to be subjective, and we bring all our bias and all of the issues that we've been discussing as a panel to that assessment. So again, a really practical tool if you're thinking that after tonight, well, maybe I'll have a second look at whether we have something going on in our organisation. It's freely accessible online. Chris, would you like to comment on individuals, leaders, organisations?
Just, two quick things. Jodeen said, look at what I've done, but I think the point to emphasise is that it was someone else tapping me on the shoulder and saying, come on, have a think about this. So it wasn't really my idea. I didn't suddenly decide to become a gender equality crusader. But once I was introduced to the idea and the possibilities, so that's really the first point, and I guess I'm repeating in a different way what I've been saying all evening, which is open up the conversation with somebody. You might spark something. And then the second thing comes back to what several of the speakers have said. Self-awareness then is your starting point for leading. Doesn't mean in a formal leadership position, but being visible, going to an event like this, and in my world, other lawyers, other judges would say, oh, you know, Chris has turned up, that's really good. He's obviously getting interested in these issues. And I thought more about language. And so, in the last few years, if I'm talking, for example, about sentencing, and I might be saying, well, if the sentencing judge was confronted by a case involving these features, what would she do? Not what would he do. And I've consciously, deliberately talked about the judge in my hypothetical example as a woman. Now, it's pretty small, but a number of people have commented on it because it makes them stop and think, oh, did he just say she? And that's waking up one's own unconscious bias and, you hope, waking it up in other people. And I suppose my last thought was this. I've noticed in the legal profession in recent years, being strong on gender equity has come to be seen as a reputational issue. We want our organisation to be a place where talented women will want to come. Now, this town is full of talented women, it's clear from the audience tonight. And I wonder whether that mightn't be just an incentive that the Chamber of Commerce might start to talk about. How are you going to get the best female graduates, the people with the best qualifications or experience? Well, it might be that you need to be showing that you understand and care about gender equality. And then the Chamber has an event where the best performing firms have a chance to talk to others about what they've tried and what works and what doesn't, and then once again listen and learn. Others will say, gee, we could have a go at that. Sounds pretty good to me. And then it starts to be, well, just what you do as a sensible business. And I'm certainly aware of this very strong view within the Champions of Change world that there's a good business case for this. But for me, that's a kind of last resort card, but it's there.
Can I just add, sorry, I think when we're talking about recruiting for businesses, there's like principles that not many of us are aware of, but there's like gender blind recruiting. So processes in which you remove the name of the individual and the agenda, and you go through the recruitment process to allow, again, opportunity, because there could be unconscious bias. They're really important things. I think that's something that at the business community can get around and talk about. I think we often see it as an impact on business when we have to look at offering people additional entitlements sometimes. But, extending, the Northern Territory Government since 2008 has had provisions for, people who are experiencing family and domestic violence. But rolling that out, we've seen it nationally, it's being spoken about being rolled out, but just the impacts that can play as well on small business. Because in the long run, you'll end up with an employee who absolutely feels valued and feels respected and actually is able to start to attend specialist appointments, talk to people about their experiences, and they feel valued. And it's not a significant cost because you will end up keeping your staff for a longer period of time. And there was a comment I think raised here tonight about privilege. Let's not look at it as always a negative, because use your privilege to open that door. Use your privilege, or our privilege in whatever aspects we have, to open the door for someone else to walk through. That is the best way we as a community can come together, because I know, as my sister here was saying, privilege is a barrier, and we can't overcome that if people are not using that privilege as the opportunity to open it to let one of our community members walk through and achieve great things.
Thanks, Chansey. That's a nice way to round out the panel, and it's almost impossible, but if I had to sum up where we got to in the panel, I think it was listen, learn, act, measure and reflect in terms of a journey